I'm Charles Watkinson. I'm the president of the Association of University Presses this year. I'm the Associate University Librarian for Publishing at University of Michigan and Director of University of Michigan Press. And I wanted to just say a few things before we properly get started. The first thing I wanted to say is we're really, I think, all of us who work in the area of open access books and funding open access books and making them work, I think we feel a big missing gap in our room today, and that is Martin Eve, Professor Martin Eve. And for those of you who know of his amazing work and his advocacy, you'll know that Martin is in hospital at the moment and he's wrestling with some serious health issues that don't prevent him from being the most productive person in the world, probably, in terms of thinking on multiple fronts about the future of open access books. So we would like to sort of dedicate this session to Martin and his continuous return to health. So first of all, I just wanted to say that as we were thinking about this panel, I had three observations I wanted to make about books that I think strike me as particularly resonant. So the first part of this is, I think academic book publishing was at some stages thought about as a bit of a backwater, but that is no longer the case. It's a very serious business. It's a very international business. There was a calculation fairly recently that maybe about 86,000 monographs, so books by scholars for scholars, are published worldwide every year, although our data is really, really lacking, and that's partly because they're published by so many different publishers, and it's such a long tail, multilingual, international type of publishing. So that said, I think it's very striking that if one was to ask people who is the largest publisher of monographs, or who are the sort of the guardians of the monograph, people might well say university presses, and they'd think of presses like Oxford and Cambridge and some of the US presses. But the reality is that the vast majority of English language monographs are now being published by commercial academic presses. So Taylor and Francis is, I think, by any stretch, the largest publisher of monographs, probably producing around 8,000 scholarly books a year. And that compares to Oxford University Press, the largest by far university press, maybe producing about 6,000 a year. And that compares to the rest of the university presses, producing about the same as Oxford. So it's a very, very, it's a big business. The second thing I wanted to point out is that books are not just collections of articles. Recent policy guidance, which talks about book chapters, I think may lead us to that impression. But from the scholarly point of view, books are famously described as a way of thinking through one's research. So that's a reference to the Crossick report, Geoffrey Crossick's 2015 report for what was then HEFKI. So it's a fundamentally different piece of work to actually think through a single or dual author book than just putting together a collection of chapters. But those two things are often blurred. And then the third thing is that books are incredibly labor intensive. If one is working on these books which go beyond being collections of chapters, this actually takes a lot of professionalized labor from publishers. And the work, for example, of an acquisitions editor is often very different in the world of book publishing than it is in journal publishing. And this is a shameless plug, but just outside on the ALPSP registration desk, just to one side of it, you'll see little cards like this, and these have QR codes on the back, and they're part of a project that I'm delighted that ALPSP has just signed on to, which is a big project to look at professionalization of publishing roles and to look at career progression in publishing. So we're gathering thousands of position descriptions, job postings of publishing professionals, and we're starting to do analysis to create some template position descriptions to look at skills progression in the publishing industry. And if you have any time, please do grab one of these cards and maybe submit your position description or things that you see online, and that would terrifically help us with that project. So that's enough from me. I want to now introduce the panelists for today. So you see panelists who are actually going to introduce themselves with some comments at the start, but Jenny Evans there from University of Westminster, Simon Bains from University of Aberdeen, and Stephanie Veldman from Brill, and Hans de Jonge from NWO, the Dutch research funder. And what we're going to do is I'm going to sort of loosely structure some questions which we've pre-shared and ask the panelists to talk through, and we'll keep the conversation moving. And we will have time for questions and answers and getting the audience involved. And there's a very nice feature on the conference app where you can actually put in your question as we're talking, and I'll be observing what's coming through the conference app. And then we'll have at the end some roving mics going round so you can speak in person. But let's get going with a very difficult question. This is to get the panel going. And the first question is, who are you? Who are you? Where do you work? And then it got much harder. What interests you about this topic? So I'm going to start with Jenny, and you might want to pull the mic a little bit down towards you, Jenny. So Jenny, who are you?
Thank you, Charles. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, lean in.
Okay.
Sorry.
How's that? That's better, isn't it? Marvellous. Okay, so I'm Jenny Evans. I'm Research Environment and Scholarly Communications Lead at the University of Westminster, based mainly in central London. My role is very hybrid, libraries and research and knowledge exchange office. So University of Westminster is very much a research engaged post-92 institution, but with a real long-standing mission. Our history dates back to 1838 of reducing inequality and maintaining equity of access and inclusion in higher education. Our discipline focus is very much arts, humanities, and social sciences, although we do have some science, media, communication, English, art and design, and it really underpins my interest in what open research looks like for arts and humanities disciplines in a scholarly communications landscape that is very driven by scientific publishing. I'm responsible for a new university open access digital first press, University of Westminster Press, and I see that very much as part of our research environment, enabling our research culture. My interests today, and I'll be quick, I promise, is sustainability of funding models for open access monographs, discoverability, enabling libraries, although I don't sit in the library now, I very much still work in collaboration with our library, and equity, who gets to publish and who gets to be that knowledge that's shared, open access.
And I'm going to add one other thing about Jenny, which is Jenny's running a very, very important project on practice-based research. So thinking about performing arts and other areas with rich media outputs and how they get recognized and celebrated in research evaluation and not left out. And I hope that you'll come and talk to Jenny if you're interested in any of those fields, right Jenny? So next up, Simon Bains, please.
Okay, hello everybody. I think that's working. Good.
Yes, that's good.
So I'm Simon Bains. I'm University Librarian at the University of Aberdeen, one of a small number of librarians at the conference. So I've got one of those green talk to me stickers on because I don't know many of you. So if you see me looking lonely, do come and say hi. I keep being told you're such a friendly bunch. So look forward to talking to you over the next couple of days. So I'm going to start by saying that one of the things that really drives me in this is being at a university that's been in existence since 1495. And in 1495, when Bishop Elphinston founded Aberdeen University, he gave it a foundational purpose. And the foundational purpose was to be open to all, dedicated to the pursuit of truth in the service of others. And nothing says open research to me like a vision statement like that, like a 500-and-something-year-old vision statement. And actually, I don't think we do it very well at the University of Aberdeen, so this is a real personal driver for me to help Aberdeen do better in open research and truly be open to all. In the context of open monographs, I think I have a particular financial interest because I struggle to find the funds to support the publication of open monographs. I have an academic community that remains nervous about open monographs, and so I'm trying to work on both of those fronts. And I see real opportunity as we make changes in the publishing journal subscription market in particular, and also wider recognition of research culture needing to include a commitment to open research. I see real opportunities that tie in our strategic direction with our 520-something year old foundational purpose.
And Simon, you're very involved in RL UK as well, or you have a national presence, I see often.
Yes, so I'm part of the Research Libraries UK organisation of research-intensive universities, so very closely connected to conversations across the sector on open research matters, and also with JISC. And I'll probably talk about JISC a bit more, but the extent to which we're all now working with JISC and through JISC, both for traditional content negotiations, as I'm sure many of you know, but also beginning to think about how JISC supports new, smaller, innovative publishing in terms of open access as well.
Thank you. And then Stephanie.
Hi everyone, can you all hear me? Yes? Okay, good. My name is Stephanie Veldman. Some of you may also know me as Stephanie Baalvast, which was my former name, but in the summer I got married. So who am I? First and foremost, clearly I'm a wife. This is my identity now. I am also the head of open research at Brill. For those of you who don't know Brill, we are a humanities-based publisher based in Leiden. I thought I had the track record to work for the oldest organization, but unfortunately we're not as old as University of Aberdeen. But still, we have been publishing, we now publish about 1,400 books per year, and we have been doing that for more than 350 years. And I hope, of course, that we can continue to do that for at least the next 350 years to come in open access. So that is my role, trying to figure out how are we making that full flip in, let's say, 100 years.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Hans.
Hi everyone, my name is Hans Jonge. I'm from the Netherlands. I work at the Dutch Research Council, where I'm head of open science policies, which makes me responsible for our open access policies, our data policies, increasingly also policies that want to improve recognition and rewards for open science policies. I think I've been invited to this panel because in the past few years I've also been very active in open access books. NWO has already 10 years ago funded the first studies into open access business models. We have an open access book policy, and to support that we also recently set up a dedicated open access book funding scheme from which our grantees can get funding if they want to publish a book in open access. We mainly, at the moment, fund those books through the so-called book publishing charge model. At NWO, we are very well aware about the problems that that model also has, and to which I think Simon already alluded a bit. We are very much open to alternative models, but in our view, that discussion moved a bit too slowly. So at our council, we thought we should at least do something, because we genuinely believe in open access also for the social science and humanities. We can't just leave such a vast domain behind. And that means also looking into open access books. That's my main driver.
Thank you very much. And I mean, just thinking about the diversity of different types of publishers producing books, I think it's also really interesting to acknowledge that in the sciences, especially in some fields like mathematics, many of the society publishers in the room may have small open book programs. This is not just about the humanities and social sciences, but it looms large in the humanities book world. And Hans mentioned BPCs. Stephanie, might I turn to you first to talk a little bit about the dominant types of open access funding models and for books in existence, and how these differ from the main funding models for OA journals. And we'll sort of go round just to see if we pick them all up. But how would you classify open access book funding models currently?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Charles. So I think, also kind of preparing for this panel, going back a little bit, of course, one of the things that, I think is now quite, how do you say that? Established is the crowdfunding model. So that was, of course, pioneered, first of all, by Knowledge Unlatched. And I think, this is still something that I think does work very well. There is development there. The way that Knowledge Unlatched first set it up was really crowdfunding for open access. So libraries were asked to fund open access, not so much the collection itself. Now you do see development there, and I do believe that there is also a scope there for, and also actually, I guess this is my point, is that that it is interlinked also with the other big funding model for books, which is of course from funders, as Hans describes. The NWO has a program. We all know the UKRI will have such a program, and those are. And in a way, the funders have already made their contribution. Let's say they have already said this. They made the step. So now it's, I think, for us, also for publishers, but also for libraries, it's really up to us to see, okay, how can we get those books that don't fall into the scope of a grant, which is the majority of books, after all. How can we get those to open access? And there will be a little bit of creativity is also required there, I think. And just more development in the market. And like I said, for me, I think crowdfunding is sort of one of the more obvious solutions.
And what other sorts of models pop to mind? Jenny, funding for University of Westminster Press, where does that come from?
Just need to remember to, there we go. So University of Westminster Press is funded via a variety of mechanisms, some of that crowdfunding model. So we have had funding from Knowledge Unlatched in the past. We do put an amount of money from our REF-related quality research funding that comes out of our research excellence framework results. For those of you not UK-based, quite a big conversation piece in the UK. So the university also funds via our first our library and now our research and knowledge exchange up as staffing and overhead. So those costs it runs, or you need to run an organisation. So there's a real mix. We do have researchers come in with grants funding, project funding, but yeah, it's a real mixed model at Westminster.
So sort of hybrid, magpie, sort of hybrid model. And so Simon, crowdfunding through libraries. Libraries have the money. You're going to be able to support open access book publishing entirely through your library funds, aren't you?
I feel like you've prepped me for that one, Charles. So no, obviously, is the answer to that. I think my belief is that it's entirely legitimate for library budgets to be funding open access. And I think the crowdfunding model is the right thing to be doing. And I've started to do that in a small way with my budget. So I have no problem in principle with using library funding. And indeed, I think in practice, if I went to my institution, to my senior leadership team and said, we need money to publish open access, they'd say, well, you've got a budget, sort it out. And so I think the extent to which we can have much more challenging conversations with some publishers about the costs of big subscriptions, the more that will generate money, it will save money so that I can start to use the money that I've got to support other things. At Aberdeen, we don't have any sort of open access fund other than the funds we get from research funders who require research funded by their grants to be open access. We don't have anything extra. So if I have an academic come to me and say, I'd like my monograph open access, I have to explore with them where the money's going to come from to do that. So it is a challenge, and I think, like all big challenges, there's no one answer. I think library budget is there to be used if we start to use it in the right way. I think there's opportunity to make a case to people who support the University of Aberdeen to say this is something it's worth supporting. You know, help make us open to all. You know, there's something there as well. And there's something about having conversations about the funds we get from research funders to support it. So we know that UKRI are going to provide funding for open access monographs. We also know it's almost certainly not going to be enough, but there'll be a mixed model. But my starting point is that I'm not immediately going out to my university and saying I need more money. I'm saying how could I make my library budget work differently in order to support this. So it feels a real challenge because so many researchers who publish long-form publications don't have research grants behind them. So it's less easy for them to do this. And culturally, they're less further along the road in terms of coming to terms with this being a thing they should do as well. So that's also a challenge. And you know, the research excellence framework's already been mentioned. Aberdeen did not do as well as we would have hoped in the research excellence framework. That has a direct impact on our bottom line over the next few years. So on the one hand, the money is going to be a challenge. On the other hand, one of the reasons we didn't do as well as we might have hoped was that our impact evidence wasn't strong enough. So there's a real case for open research on that basis. We must do something about this in order to do better in the next research assessment, whatever form that takes.
It's a very interesting question that you raised about UKRI and the amount of money that's being ring-fenced for open access books at currently £3.5 million, and whether that is enough. And I understand, you know, one of the issues is there's very little data. The data to know how many books UKRI supports, how much would be a reasonable amount to fund is all very murky. But Hans, a long time ago, before a lot of the studies were done, NWO set a stake in the ground and said 10,000 euros would be a reasonable amount. How did the thinking go into that? Was that the right number? And what is the right number?
To be honest, I don't know. I don't know exactly what the right number is, but indeed we have said if you're an NWO-funded researcher and you want to publish your book open access, you can apply for 10K to be used as a book publishing charge. We don't get many complaints that is too little. We sometimes see that publishers lower their prices to be able to apply for our fund. We just started it. As you know, we also try to do our math and see how many books we actually support per year, how much money would be needed. There's no way to find that out actually. We didn't know, we just started because we felt it was the right thing to do. Starting small, we have a budget for this at the moment of around only half a million, not much, so we can fund 50 books a year. And actually, I have to say, we still do not yet do that. So funding might be a problem, but convincing the community is a whole different story and needs to be done also, and will take time.
So any other comments on open access funding as it exists now before we turn to the question of should, could, the future? Or shall we go there? Okay, so let's go there. So who should fund OA books in the future? And especially, what questions should those of us who care about book publishing be asking funders as the UK, US, and European funding agency continue to refine their policies on OA books this year? And of course, we'll expect really specific instructions from UKRI later this fall and into the spring, no later than April. And the OSTP memo in the United States covers the agencies who fund books for the first time, and it specifically mentions book chapters. So we're expecting agencies to have policies coming out from places like the National Endowment for the Humanities later this fall. So big moment. And what should we be asking? Is there a perfect solution? How are you all thinking about this? Who should fund open access book publishing? And we need an answer now, because this will shape.
Can I press the buzzer?
Yes.
No, well, actually, just to your point about OSTP, I think, I hope this will resonate with many, that first and foremost, do not treat book chapters as journal articles. They are really two different beasts. And that is, and so, but of course we are not here in the US, we are here in the UK, luckily. Yeah, that is the first thought that comes to my mind. Other than that, yeah, I suppose that is just to kind of reiterate my point that, looking at how can we work with all the stakeholders in the system, so that includes not just the funders who are already doing this, and then there, maybe with the funders, I suppose there is a bridge to be crossed kind of in the translation to what Hans just says, the translation to authors, to researchers, to make sure that they are actually aware that there is an open access policy. I mean, that seems self-evident, but actually that we have found, and what Hans just says confirms that that is not always the case. So they kind of realize too late. And then they can't work it in their budget anymore, or they can't apply anymore, or that kind of thing. So that is really, I think, quite key, is just communication about this. And the other thing is also to, of course, be mindful of the diverse landscape of book publishing. As you just said, Charles, linguistic diversity, also diversity in formats. That will also be something that, for, I think, books policy, they will need to be, perhaps more flexible than policies for journal articles.
Yeah, the small publishers, and especially multilingual publishers, I had the privilege of sitting down with Rita from Finland at lunchtime, and the issue of multilingualism and the Helsinki Declaration on Multilingualism and the importance of preserving that bibliodiversity is a very, very big issue. Simon, you are about to be held to account for starting Aberdeen University Press. So this is a big question on your mind, right? Sustainability for the long term for a new university press, launching October 25th, or anyhow, soon. How are you thinking at this point, and are you losing sleep?
I forgot to advertise that, so thank you, Charles. We are standing up, or perhaps relaunching Aberdeen University Press, which has existed back over 100 years, but the press as an organisation ceased to exist in the 90s. The imprint remained for a small number of publications, mainly in Scottish and Irish studies, but we are about to relaunch it as an open access press. It will be run within the library, so it's moved across from one of our research institutes into the library. And our vision, my vision, is diamond open access. I want to be providing a service that doesn't charge the author or the reader. So that's ducking the question to some extent, because the next question is, well, where is the money coming from? And the answer to that for our press is we still don't really know. We're looking at probably a mixed model. We're not going to turn away authors who've got a research grant behind them which covers the cost of open access. I will be looking at how much of my library budget can be used to support the press and its publications. We will be making a case to the university, because I don't think, I don't see open access as being just about a stick that the funders hit us with. A lot of our academics do open access because the funder is hitting them with a stick, but actually, we're at a university that's open to all. We've got a very long-reaching strategy at Aberdeen 2040, which commits to open research. So I don't think the institution conduct this and say the money's all got to come from the funders because they're telling us to do it. I think as an institution, we need to think about it. And where we're talking about humanities disciplines who are publishing long-form publications and don't have specific research grants behind them, they sometimes talk, we sometimes talk about unfunded research, but of course that's nonsense. You know, the funding is still coming from the government to the university to do that. So we need to have conversations about, well, what's the funding that comes to us? What's the funding supposed to do that we get from the university to cover our research? And should we start to think about being very explicit that some of that funding should be there to support open research? So I don't have academics coming to me saying, I want to publish my book open access, but I don't have a research grant, therefore there's no money. You know, that can't be the right answer. And I won't have a library budget big enough to cover that. But I think that is an institutional challenge, not a library challenge. If we are genuine about our strategy and genuine that we need to do better on impact, and genuine that we're not just doing this because someone's telling us to, then we need to invest. But of course also do our best to lobby the funders to say, if you are supporting the research you're funding to publish open access, support it appropriately and recognise the costs of monograph publishing as compared to publishing an article in a journal.
I think your quote from Bishop Elphinstone is so interesting, because there was somebody in the 15th century who saw the mission of the university as including and actually centering the dissemination of knowledge. And that question of funding things like the creation of books, this scholars working through their research in the form of a monograph as core humanities infrastructure funding, not being borne by the parts of the institution that fund infrastructure, not necessarily the library, sounds like it's a very, very important point. And I wanted to ask about infrastructure investment. So we know book world is a bit messed up in terms of metadata, preservation, all kinds of things that journals take for granted. What, in addition to funding direct costs of book production, are there infrastructure investments needed to make OA for books successful? And I will just say there are some questions coming in through the chat, and we're going to go to questions soon. There's a very interesting one here. Keep submitting those questions. But
I think I'm going to volunteer to answer this one first, because it's something I feel passionately about in terms of open standards, but also discoverability, and about how we enable libraries to fund open access monographs, to enable them to find open access monographs. It's really, really hard to find them. Even if you've got them in your library discovery tool, you might not know you have them. And also how we support libraries to manage compliance as well, and manage that funder compliance, because it's a nightmare for journals, and the monographs landscape's even wider. So I think really funding that infrastructure, that I know the TOTE project work that's coming out of COPIM is really exciting, because from what I see, that kind of landscape is a mess at the moment. It's very disconnected. It's very hard to find this research.
And could you just say a little bit more about COPIM, and do you remember what it stands for?
If you could help me out on that one, that would be good. It was...
Yes, you could go for it, and then I'm going to tell you exactly what it stands for.
Open, yeah. I think that would be good.
But with Martin Eve absent, so COPIM, community-led open publication infrastructures for monographs.
Amazing, thank you. I was going to write that down this morning, and I was like, no one will ask. No one asks what it stands for. COPIM is fine. And COPIM are leading a number of work packages around various elements of open access monographs publishing, one of them being preservation, but really the strength of bringing those different disconnected, I guess, landscapes together. And it's something that libraries, I think, can do a lot of great work in, but at the moment it's challenging. We have a university press funded from QR funding mainly, but university funding as well, but actually having that conversation around how it fits in with the library strategy, when actually you have to go and find these resources, is really tricky.
I'd like to bring in a question from the audience, and Michael Casp, if you'd be willing to ask this question in person, that would be great. Are you present? There is a roving microphone that might rove towards you in a moment. Is there a roving microphone? There's one, yes, very, very good. the aim is to have people just down here, sorry. It's the aim is for people to ask questions as far apart as possible to make it as difficult as possible. So, Michael, could you ask your question or make your statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Michael Cast, J&J Editorial. And of course, after all that build-up, it was actually less a question, more a comment. We put together, I put together quotes for publishing services, and I feel that the number you put out earlier, 10,000, is about right from my perspective of what it would take to publish a book.
So dig into that a bit.
access.
So what are the components of that estimate?
You know, I just closed the estimate. I should have kept it up, but I mean, I'd say copy editing, project management are the ones that are going to drive a lot of the costs. You know, a lot of the typesetting and things like that often happen offshore, so that they don't eat up too much. But yeah, when I put it together, because I put together a estimate just last week for a university open access book, so pretty close to what we're talking about, and yeah, it came out to be, I think, about 12,000 USD for all the services that they needed that would be applicable to this. So I feel like that number is pretty close. That should get you most of the way there, if not completely.
Thank you. So what's missing in that number? You mentioned infrastructure. I mean, what is Michael not having to take account of that exists in the landscape? Hans, do you have, when you think about infrastructure for books, is it just copy editing and typesetting?
Probably not. I'm not feeling I'm the real expert when it comes to open book infrastructure, but I can imagine indeed there's a need for it. I think in your home country there's a huge debate now raging about costs for open access university press books. I think partly the point is that the production costs are really high. I think that's partly because the university presses are often very small, and that it can help to have shared infrastructure for these university presses, and especially also for the new library-based open access book publishers that are coming up everywhere now, and Simon is starting end of October. I think development of open infrastructures for these kinds of presses would be very welcome. And to be honest, NWO would be, I think, very interested to contribute to in funding such initiatives.
So, Stephanie, for example, as an experienced book publisher, I mean, how are you thinking about this very wide differentiation between 5,000 euros is the right number versus $30,000 is the right number? Why is it so different, depending on who you ask?
It is always a fun topic, of course. No, you know, I think so we can have this conversation two ways, and I will do it my way because it's the only way that I know how to do it. So basically, the one way to do it is a lesson in accounting, right? That is what it comes down to. Do we want to do that? No, none of us here are accountants, we don't care, huh? The other way, and this is what I think is kind of key to the conversation, and also, I suppose, key to the cost is, okay, it's typesetting, it's copy editing, it's production, but there's one, I think, key element in book publishing, and that is people. And really, and well, also in journal publishing maybe, but anyway, definitely for book publishing, you do need the people, you need the acquisitions editors. The thing also with book publishing, definitely how Brill approaches it anyway, and I think many of you here as well, is that do book publishing is, it is really co-created with community. It's really our acquisitions editors going out into the fields, having conversations with their networks, with their editorial boards, you know, and through those conversations teasing out, oh, hey, this is a new hot topic in the field, right? This is what's going on. This is, you know, we need a new book series, or we need a new title on this or that. So that it's not like we are just a service provider. Yeah? We are really, I would say, a full part of that community. And so this is why I think in the cost you also need to factor in people. And for me, this is really the added value that publishers provide.
Yeah, and Simon, do you?
Yeah, the people bit is a concern for me. I think we're about to launch Aberdeen University Press. We are in project mode at the moment, so we've got a team of people working on this as a project to get it live. The question then is sustainability. And I think we've got some work to do in terms of the people side of this. So we are outsourcing some of the work. We're outsourcing infrastructure, we're outsourcing publishing expertise. But we will need people on the ground talking to academics, working out, you know, what the contract's going to be, what the costs are going to be, thinking about the marketing side of this, because a huge part of this for us is resurrecting a brand and raising Aberdeen's profile as an open research institution and using a brand that has a real heritage to it, some very iconic publications in the past. So that issue of how do you resource a press and what expertise do you need and what does that cost is a live issue for me. In terms of infrastructure, I think that's a really interesting question. I think talking to Hans earlier, we have, some of you may know this, we also have something developing in Scotland called the Scottish Universities Press. And that's a collaborative venture between universities on the basis that they're going to share the cost and share the infrastructure. So always helpful, I think, to think in terms of sharing and benefiting from economies of scale. And then the other thing that occurred to me just as we were talking about these sorts of issues, infrastructural issues, is, and I think somebody mentioned this, I can't remember which of my panel colleagues, but the discovery issue. I mean, it's just, it can be such a mess. You know, we can make things, the irony is that in libraries, sometimes the hardest things to find are the open access things in terms of how our library systems work, because they're not built to do that. You know, they're built to manage and control and make available the things that we would buy and make available in a traditional library way. They're not very good at having, first of all, having the open access record and then making it discoverable and making it clear that it is open access. So I think there's a job to do in terms of our own systems, which weren't created to deal with this sort of thing, and for the vendors who provide those big library management systems to help us achieve this. Because I think one of the real selling points, I think, in to academics who are looking at me skeptically thinking, why do I want to do this, is showing how many people will read your publication if you make your monograph open access. And that's something that University College London seem to do so well whenever I see them speak. I don't know if somebody from the press there is here, but always talking about the attention a publication has got and the number of times it's been downloaded and how much better that is, you know, than 50 libraries buying a copy and putting it on their shelves. So making it discoverable and used simply demonstrates the benefit, and it helps us make the case for the income to support it.
Sorry, Charles, I really want to respond to that.
Please,
actually,
good.
because there are two key things here, I think. So the one is that, you know, when we talk about infrastructure, we all have our ideas of what it should look like, but I think one of the elements of infrastructure is also infrastructure for impact, exactly as you say. What KPIs do we need for open access books? How can we demonstrate impact? And it kind of links to, and I'm sorry, Charles, because now I am actually intervening in your...
Good, good.
sorry about
Please,
that.
please.
Because I know you will be asking this
You
question.
can stand over there.
No, I don't want to take over. No, but that is about we need to get this right. And the reason is, you know, I'm thinking about what you say, indeed, about the discovery for open access books, which is rubbish still. But the thing is, I am reminded too of, I don't know, if many of you are hopefully familiar with that, is the Stm Tech Trends. And for this year, the topic was open at scale, which assumes, and I think we are all actually in agreement on that in the industry, that we are moving towards an open future. We don't know exactly how, when are we there in 5 years, are we in 10 years, but for journal articles, this is an irreversible process. We will get there. So that means that there is this whole body of research which is openly available, and also that infrastructure, those platforms will be geared towards open content. But then what actually does that mean for the closed content? What does that mean for the books that aren't open? They will sink. And so what does that mean for their research fields? They will sink. So this is why, you know, I am really quite passionate about we have to get this right also for the books, and we have to do it now.
Martin Eve and Anthony Cond last year wrote in Research Information, without investment in pilots and without author engagement with open access monographs, we will reach a bad place. We will reach a world where all scientific work is free to read by the public, but all humanities work is prohibitively expensive. we must avoid this elitist world at all costs. So the stakes are pretty high here. So something that strikes me on the discovery side is when we look at University of Michigan's Research Information Management System, which is symplectic elements based, we constantly see profiles with only journal articles in them when we know those scholars have written 3 or 4 books. And that feels a very concerning space as RIM and CRIS systems. Jenny, you work in that space. Are you feeling that concern that those systems are not keeping up?
I think I possibly will veer into my practice research work here, which suspect this is where you thought I might head. I think what's interesting is the policy landscape. So there's a policy landscape that drives open access journal articles, and that's the interoperability is there. So if you publish a journal article, it ends up in your CRIS system very easily. That's not the case for open access monographs. It's not the case for practice research in not just arts and humanities, but those disciplines. So there is an incredible amount of work done, and actually these researchers, and I think that culture change piece is really important. You can't impose a scientific publishing open access model on arts and humanities and social science researchers. So I think the conversations need to be quite nuanced, and to understand and to engage with these communities, you need to engage on their terms. And a lot of the practice research work we're doing is around engaging with those communities on their terms and working with them to develop infrastructure. And so I think very much to bring these communities along, like we have to work with them and alongside them, rather than imposing this scientific publishing landscape on them. But that interoperability piece and metadata is key. And I say this as a librarian, the metadata needs to be right, so it ends up in the CRIS system. Our CRIS system does have book chapters, journal articles, and practice research in it, but that's taken the last 4 or 5 years of working with those communities. So yeah, it takes some time.
Thinking about research evaluation and ways of thinking differently about books, Hans, you have been doing some really interesting work in the Netherlands.
Yes, and I think you're referring to our national program on recognition and rewards. So indeed, there's a huge debate going on in the Netherlands right now, which is geared towards really reforming the way academics are being evaluated, both in their institutions, but also in a funder context. And importantly, also with a view to foster open science. So, and that's also, I think, I agree with that very much. So funders have been very influential, I think, over the past 15 years in bringing open access or making open access a reality by imposing mandates. I don't think we can do completely without mandates, but it's definitely not enough. Open science will only become a reality if institutions, but also funders, start really recognizing and rewarding researchers for the effort they put into open science practices.
So I'd like to turn it to the audience. If anybody has a question or a comment, please raise your hands. And yes, down at the bottom here, Simon, and can you start by identifying yourself, please? It's just coming to your left there.
Hi, everybody. So my name's Simon Holt, and I'm with Elsevier. So I really liked what all the panel have said in terms of differentiating between books and journals in terms of use case, in terms of STM and arts and humanities, and also, therefore, in terms of the metrics by which we evaluate impact. And it strikes me that the way that we need to go about this, it's not at a publisher level, right? It's going to be at a funder level, right? So I would be interested to hear the panel's view on what steps we can take as an industry to really educate funding bodies, I suppose, to move towards understanding that the criteria by which we evaluate books can't possibly be the same by which we evaluate journal content if we want to create a sustainable future for open access book publishing.
What a great question. And just before this panel, several of us in the university press community came from a consultation with UKRI, where it was absolutely clear that they were eager for this kind of input. Complete lack of data, not complete, but almost lack of data. They want this input. So what would you say in engaging with Simon's question?
Well, as I'm Simon as well, I should probably try and answer it first. My sense is, certainly in the UK, that there's a receptive funder audience to try and understand this. So, you know, as we've worked through to the new UKRI open access policy, there's been an awful lot of engagement and attempts to understand. So what I'm not sure on, because I'm not a publisher, is how much that has involved you all. Certainly there's been a lot of conversations with libraries. And now there's also, I think, a much better, more joined up approach to conversations about publishing across the library community, working with central agencies like JISC, who then connect very closely to the funders. You know, and the person who led a lot of the UKRI open access development actually came from JISC, and before that a library. So we've got good connections. It's about finding those spaces to have those conversations. I don't get a sense that there'd be a sort of unwillingness to do it. I think it's who needs to be in that room to have those conversations to educate both the libraries, I think, and the funders as to what the differences are. You know, because I'm approaching this from your point of view probably quite naively. You know, I'm a librarian, I'm not a publisher. I don't know the complexity of it. You know, but there are things occurring to me just now which you know, I want to challenge, you know, more broadly. What do we even mean by open research as we go forward? What is it we're trying to make available? And is it even helpful to carry on talking about monographs versus journals? You know, is that what we should be doing in a digital world? And the other challenge is, sorry, I'm probably going off on slightly a tangent now, not answering the question, but I think the other challenge that I think needs to be in the mix is there's so much interest in interdisciplinarity. You know, and that's coming from the funders as well as from the institutions. So what does that look like? So I think we'd be in a probably the wrong place if we started thinking just about, in this silo, how do we fix monograph publishing for humanities? And I agree with Martin, you know, he's painting quite a bleak vision for the humanities, but I think we need to think more broadly about, well, what about interdisciplinary work? What about bringing a scientist who's used to publishing a journal article together with a humanist who's used to publishing long form? What's that going to end up looking like, and where's it going to go? So I think there are broader issues to think about. But whenever I've had conversations with funders, I find them very, very interested and engaged and consultative in trying to understand. But that's from a library point of view. And we've had UKRI representatives in Research Libraries UK meetings where we've had some really helpful and constructive conversations. So if that's not happening with the publishing community, then I think that the potential is there for it to start.
So,
Yeah.
yes, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, just a quick
Stephanie.
chip in. I mean, I imagine that, you know, an independent organization like Counter could play a role as well. I think that is an obvious sort of choice. And then I'm going to play devil's advocate and say maybe this is a nice project for Coalition S.
I will say that there's a question at the back with a microphone. Anybody interested in open access books? Open Access Book Network is terrific, by the way. I thoroughly recommend that as a further deep dive. So question at the back. Could you identify yourself, please?
Yes, Katrina McCallum, Director of Open Science at Hindawi. So I'm coming very much from a STEM background and a journal publishing background. And I have a comment and a question. The first was actually to really applaud the idea of this Scottish Universities Press. That will not only achieve economies of scale, but also allow a press to scale and grow its content. And I also think could have hugely influential power on the sort of publishing landscape and with policies. I think that's a really nice idea, in the same way that if societies of disciplines could get together, they would have much more leverage, I think, with pushing forward an agenda for open science. The other thing is you've all talked a lot about how you can't equate journal publishing and book publishing, but I also agree that you can learn from each other. And I had a very interesting conversation with one of the founders of Punctum Press about a version of record in the humanities. And the way that the version of record, it doesn't really have the same sort of concept within book publishing. This is really interesting because I think journal articles can learn from that, and it becomes very relevant within a digital environment to think of, this is Bianca Kramer's word, a record of versions. But the practical question for that is, when you update a book or a monograph, would, first of all, the cost, would the cost be reduced for the update? I imagine it wouldn't, depending on, or potentially on the time. But also the question is, what could you teach the journal publishing world about not worrying about the record of version and helping to promote a version of records? I'll stop there.
So we're coming in on the time we need to hand over. So I think, Katrina, that's a very interesting question. I would say that one thing that's very striking in the US funders is their interest in the sciences and humanities informing each other. And NSF particularly very interested in the work that Jenny's doing in terms of thinking about, in the sciences, lab notebooks, Jupyter notebooks, the way in which books like things are starting to be much more multimodal. It's very exciting. I will say also that this question of standardization and scale and the question of the pluses and minuses is really coming up in the live Q&A. So that's very interesting. We only have a few minutes. I do want to, and I know there's another question down there, but I do want to turn to the panelists with a call to action question. If you each had one call to action for book publishers developing their OA strategy right now, what would it be? Hans, go.
I'm listening.
Although we as NWO are and will stay, continue to be prepared to, at least for the foreseeable future, fund books through book publishing charges, really make work of alternative business models, alternative funding models. Don't stick to that model. Please also find other models. We're happy to invest, think along. But
Thank
please,
you.
yeah.
Stephanie.
Yeah, one word, VAT is an issue also for books and for open access. That's the big one. The other one is the devil's in the detail, practical solutions. We have a lot of practical challenges in open access book publishing. We need practical solutions. Also, communicate.
Communicate with authors and funders.
Yes, well, to everyone, really, I suppose. Also libraries.
Libraries as well. Simon.
Find solutions that you can work with libraries to deliver. The thing that worries me at the moment is where we're going with e-textbooks and the development of models that go round the library and start fragmenting our costs, and we can't control our costs, and we find we don't have models that libraries can afford to buy on behalf of their communities. It's really the wrong way for universities to manage and make their information available. So solutions that we can develop at scale to provide through the library.
Thank you. And last but not least, Jenny.
Thank you. And for me, it's equity. It's thinking about who gets to publish and whose knowledge is being published. And that might be discipline level, type of institution, where in the world you are. Just bear in mind, not every researcher has access to a policy mandate or funding.
So we're going to pass straight over to David Summer in a moment for the next session, but we just heard on Twitter that Martin has been released from hospital, and I think it would be meaningful to him if you could all say, "Get better, Martin," and I'll film you doing it. So if you can now go, "Get better, Martin." 1, 2, 3.
Get better, Martin.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much to our panelists. We will be going straight into the next session, and you'll find them around the place. So thank you so much.